The last quarter of a decade has been a roller coaster for international managers who wanted to build a career in China. Around the time that I arrived in China in 2002, the country had 1 billion people, an economy that was roughly that of the size of France, and one that had just merited a membership in the World Trade Organization 1 year before. 1 decade after that, the country was the second biggest economy of the world, had a track record of double-digit growth consistently over many years, and became a true dreamland for international managers who wanted to build a global career. But then around 2016, which is what I call the end of the golden age for expatriate managers in China, something started turning around. The economy has cooled to something like 5% a year, which is above world average, but very far from what the economy produced before. Opportunities for international managers became fewer and farther between, and expat talent, especially high-level expat talent, started to shun, to avoid China as a destination for the next stage of their career. In this video, we are going to look at why that is. We are going to look at trends in different talent segments. And perhaps most importantly, we are going to look at what kind of opportunities there are for managers who are managing human resources on behalf of companies and for people who themselves are thinking of building a career in China. I'm Gabor Holch, intercultural leadership consultant and author of the book Dragon Suit, The Golden Age of Expatriate Executives in China, living in China for 20 years and currently splitting my time between Europe and Asia. Now, before we go into the details, I would like to make sure that nobody can accuse me of starting from a wrong premise, saying that no, international talent does not avoid China. Actually, I would like to show you that international talent supply, and especially if we look at how it matches with the demand in the country, is being eroded from two sides. Number one, the overall number of foreigners in China, and number two, the kind of talent that is needed in China and the kind of international talent that arrives in China in recent years. If we look at the numbers of foreigners in China, it is very difficult to get reliable data because the main source of data is the national census in China, which is only held every 10 years. But if we look at the curve over time, what we are going to see is that during the 2010 census, there were about 600,000 foreign-born residents in China. Then there was, of course, a big gap between the 2010 and 20 censuses. But journalists, research organizations, and specifically the United Nations estimated that somewhere in between the two censuses, let's say in 2015-16, there must have been around 1 million foreign-born residents in China. Despite that estimation, the 2020 census found that there were only 850,000 foreigners living in China. We don't know if that's because the 1 million estimate had been wrong before, or because due to the cooling of the Chinese economy and certain political factors, a considerable proportion of foreigners in China had left between 2015 and 20. Then, obviously, the COVID pandemic was a huge blow to the foreign population in China, and the American and European chambers estimated that during that time, about half of foreigners left China. Now, even if we assume that some of them have returned, I think we can safely assume that the foreign population of China today is about half of what it was at its high point in, let's say, 2015, about half of that 1 million estimate. And that is extremely low in international comparison. If there are about 500,000 foreigners in China today, which is the same as about 20 years ago, that would be the same as foreign residents in my native country, Hungary. But whereas in Hungary's case, that would be about 5% of the overall population, in China's case, it would be less than 0.03% of the overall population. Extremely low in international comparison. Another piece of evidence that international talent avoids China these days is the consistent reports from international chambers of commerce, multinational companies, and think tanks that both foreign and local Chinese companies are seriously struggling both to attract and retain international talent, as these screenshots from the European and the American Chambers of Commerce will show you. One of the surprising aspects of this story is that inflows of foreign talent did not resume after the pandemic, despite the economy having picked up and despite some efforts from the Chinese government to try to attract foreigners back into the country. And people often ask me at events or during coaching why that is. I think if we want to understand why international talent, especially high-level international talent, people who have several options when they plan the next stage of their career, are avoiding China today, we have to look at why, according to some estimates, China was the most attractive expat destination something like 15 years ago. If we look at systematic studies like the HSBC's Expat Explorer Survey that explain why international expat talent chooses one destination over another, you can see China over many years among the most attractive countries in the world, but you can also see that the primary reason why international managers chose China as a destination was to supercharge their careers. Managers over many years, until about 2016 when the trend started to reverse, could simply take their career to an entire new level when they accepted an expat assignment to China. If you put yourself into the shoes of an international manager, especially from a highly developed economy in those days, what you would have seen is that managers who relocated from Germany, United States, Japan, South Korea, and so on, found themselves in a situation where demand was high, infrastructure was in an early stage of development, so it needed upgrading, economic development was fast and dynamic, the population and the country's territory was big. So in practical terms, it meant that as soon as you picked up as a high-level manager of a Chinese manufacturing company or chemical company or even a service company, you started managing projects that were 10 times as big, 10 times as valuable, and 10 times as likely to scale up within a few years than you would have been back at home. This is what brought international managers to China, to build lucrative and highly dynamic careers with very high global exposure. The same studies show that factors such as work-life balance and cultural interest, education for the kids, they usually took the back seats when people made decisions to relocate to China. Now, if you look at the situation today, many of those factors are simply not there. The economy is still growing. It's growing above the world average, but very, very far from what it produced, let's say, 10 or even 15 years ago. Another important factor is that the multinational companies that had brought most of these expats into the country, they don't have the same competitive advantage as they did, let's say, 10 or 15 years ago, due to very dynamically growing local competition, which also means that they don't have the same market share and the same volume that supercharged all of these expat careers in the past. All of this put together means that an expatriate executive that relocates to China operates in a slower, less lucrative environment, and their companies have less opportunity, less potential in the country than they had in the golden years. This means that talented international managers today leave China or do not accept assignments in China for exactly the same reasons as they did 10 or 15 years ago. They want exactly the same things as they wanted before. They want to upgrade their international careers. They want to work in an environment whose economic waves they can ride towards higher volumes. And very importantly, and we often forget this, just like 10 or 15 years ago, they do not have particular interest in Chinese culture. They never chose their next career step based on attraction to the country itself. They just wanted a favorable work environment. The same ambitions today drive these managers out of China, or if they are not in China yet, then towards other developing economies. Economies that create the same kind of dynamics as China did 15, 20, 25 years ago. Lots of people remember that in China the population is falling, whereas, for example, in India, in Indonesia, it is growing. A dynamically growing economy in an early stage of development where these companies that send these expats abroad can build the very infrastructure that is needed for the economic development. And of course, lots of demand for stuff, for services, and for the kind of know-how and management systems that give these international companies a competitive advantage over local competition. All of that is not there in China anymore. Now, of course, China has serious international ambitions and want to play an important global role. So if you put yourself now into the shoes of the Chinese government, you can see that they are supposed to bend over backwards to attract high-value international talent in large numbers to match with the international ambitions of the Chinese economy. And if you look at the news of the last 2 years, you can see that China really made serious efforts to get out of the self-inflicted isolation that a very, very strict COVID policy put the country into. They made very active efforts to increase the number of flights in and out of China, which ground to almost a complete halt during the years of the pandemic, and to reduce their prices, which reached ridiculous levels right after the pandemic. They introduced visa-free entry for selected countries in the world, so many people from Southeast Asia, from Europe, can visit China now without a visa. And if we look a little bit further into the past, then we can see programs like the 1,000 Talent Program, whose aim was to get high-level international talent into primarily the scientific and research and development sector of China. But you will also see that there is a significant mismatch between the kind of talent that enters China due to these policies and the kind of talent that both multinational and local companies would need at this stage of development of the Chinese economy. To understand where the mismatches are, I'm going to look at 3 segments of international workers in China. One of them is expats or expat managers, international managers who are typically brought in by multinational companies, locally hired foreigners, and students who would like to stay and work in China. Now, it is a well-published fact that China is experiencing serious problems drawing foreign direct investment into the country, which has fallen in the recent year significantly. And the Chinese government is making active efforts to attract international investment back into the country, the primary vehicle of which is multinational companies. One of the best ways to achieve that would be to convince the high-level managers, the executives who run these companies, that China is a very attractive place to be, to invest, to visit, and to live in. However, if you look at the situation with the eyes of those expatriate managers, those are the people I coach, I support, I advise and train, the situation is not really attractive right now. As I mentioned, China simply doesn't have the kind of buzz that it had before. If you are relocating to China as an international manager, you don't have the double-digit growth anymore. Your multinational company is not naturally ahead of local competition anymore. The consumption environment, the investment environment is not what it was before. And there are some other disadvantages which are not so obvious as the ones that I mentioned right now. First, due to both Chinese government policies, but also the strategies of international companies themselves, multinational firms in China have been consistently localizing their strategies, which means replacing international managers, but also it means other things. For example, they registered their companies in China not as internationally invested entities, but as local Chinese companies. For international managers, this has many consequences. One of them is that they themselves work in a more local environment. So whereas 10 or 15 years ago, if you worked for a multinational branch that had 1,000 people, then typically about a fifth of them would have been foreigners, whereas right now, only a couple of people would be foreigners. It also means, for example, that the manager in charge, if it's not a Chinese person, Chinese fluency is much more of a condition to build a successful managerial career in China today than 10 or 15 years ago. And very few talented international managers have that fluency in Chinese. Localized multinational branches also mean that it's much harder to hire foreigners into those companies than before. A foreign registered entity in China 10 or 15 years ago found it very easy to move international talent in and out of the country, whereas now, if this international branch is registered as a Chinese entity, there is much more paperwork than before, and it is much more likely that some of these international managers will be rejected by the Chinese government's visa standards. China is also a different environment in terms of most international managers' ambition to be left alone by politics and just build business and build their careers undisturbed. During the golden years of multinational executives in China, which I consider to be something from 2000 to 2016, the Chinese government actively tried to stay away from multinational business, whereas in the last 10 years or so, it has introduced increasingly strict controls of data flowing in and out of the country, of usage of the internet, of what can be published, for example, what data is available for research, and many other restrictions that international managers experience as an interference into the regular running of managerial business. Finally, it's important to mention that interest comes from experience. Many of the executives from Europe, the United States or Southeast Asia that I interviewed for Dragon Suit said they eventually wanted to relocate to China because they previously visited the country for a research trip or meetings, negotiations, or trade fairs, for example. We shouldn't forget that in the last 5 years, the number of people who were allowed to visit the country decreased drastically. And it means in the longer term, simply interest in the country decreased because people forget very easily if they don't have the opportunity to visit the country. The country is simply not in such a prominent place in their personal radar. So if interest from multinational executives who might be sent to the country is not so intensive as before, let's look at another important segment of international employees in China, which is locally hired foreigners. If you spend some time in China, you know that locally hired foreigners traditionally came from 3 sources. One of them is teachers, specifically foreign language teachers. The other one is the service industry that cater to the expatriate community in China itself, such as real estate agents, insurance brokers, bankers, and so on. And finally, managerial or technical staff that arrived in the country with an expatriate contract, which means they were sent into China by their home companies, and very often they were paid in their home countries. But when these expatriate contracts expired, they wanted to stay in the country and they started to look for jobs with local contracts. Now, if you look at these 3 sources, you can immediately see that all of them were cut off at the root in the last 5 years or so. The number of international teachers in the country started decreasing drastically in 2018 and 19 when the Chinese government introduced very strict visa controls for teachers that could arrive and stay in the country. Then the COVID years further decimated the number of international teachers, and finally in 2022 the Chinese government cracked down on the tutoring industry, which means language schools, private tutors, and very often the extra classes of international schools, which further took away the livelihood of many of the international teachers that were in the country and could have potentially become long-term residents in the country. If we look at the second source of international managers in China, which was traditionally from the industries that catered to the expat community, such as real estate agencies, banks, insurance agencies, and so on, obviously the number required in these industries with a dwindling international population in China and then the COVID pandemic and then eventually very strict COVID lockdowns made it very, very hard for these people to stay in the country and keep their jobs. And finally, if we look at those international managers, employees who arrived in the country traditionally with an expat contract, but when it expired, they wanted to stay in the country. First of all, multinational companies don't offer that many of these contracts in the first place because they are not so profitable in China as before. Their market share is not so large, and so they don't need so many international managers. But also, if one of those contracts expires and somebody wants to stay in the country with the COVID years and then post-COVID lockdowns, it is not so easy to stay in the country. And if you look at visa regulations now, it is easy to arrive in the country for a business visit of a few days, of a few weeks. But if you want to stay in the longer term, it is significantly harder than it was 10 years ago. Finally, let's say a few words about students. Traditionally, again, a very, very important source of international employees and eventually managers in China. Now, transitioning from a student status into an employment status has never been easy. Actually, many of the students who studied in China, once their studies ended, they very often had to leave the country and then re-enter with the visa sponsorship of their new employers. But of course, after studying in China, either in a short term as an exchange student or very often for years, these people were actively interested in working in China and made the effort to come back as expatriate employees or managers. And this is the source of international employees in China, which didn't just dwindle, but was entirely cut off during the pandemic years. So many students who started their studies in China, they were only able to continue them virtually while the country was under lockdown. Very often, let's say if somebody was in Europe or the Middle East, 5, 6 or 7 time zones away, or in the American continent, 12 time zones away, which was extremely hard for these people. And then when the country reopened to students, it was much easier and happened much sooner that they welcomed students from Russia, from South Asia, from Southeast Asia. And if you look at the numbers, even now, previously very, very prominent countries that gave many of the students, such as the United States, Japan or Western Europe, are still heavily underrepresented in the international student population of China. So to summarize in a couple of words, international talent, expat talent, tends to avoid China these days because even before the pandemic, there were dwindling opportunities due to the country's slowing economy. Then the pandemic years disrupted the source, the supply of international talent entirely. And even if the country is opening now and the government is making active efforts to welcome foreigners back into the country, it doesn't give the same kind of opportunity as it did during the high time of international employees and expat communities in China. Now, of course, many of you will say that there are lots and lots of people who are hoping to work in China right now, and that international talent is needed both in international companies and in Chinese companies with global ambitions. And I perfectly agree with you. There are people every week who write to me because they are looking for opportunities to work or start a company in China. So, are there opportunities for foreigners in China right now? Of course there are. People who can make use of these opportunities are usually falling into one of these two categories. Either they are managers who manage human resources, so very simply put, hire people on behalf of a company, or they are job seekers who are trying to build a career in China. So I would like to say a couple of words to both of these groups of people, or actually it's 3 groups, because the first one, managers, would fall into 2 kinds of circumstances. First, if you work for a company that is in the position to bring foreign talent into China, you have a huge advantage right now. Companies like that tend to fall into a few categories. For example, automotive companies which are currently heavily investing in China despite the general trend to withdraw investment, such as BMW or Scania, the truck company, or even a company like Tesla. If you work for a company like that, and if you are in the position to bring foreign talent to China, you are having a huge advantage as both fulfilling a need, giving an opportunity to people who would like to build a career in China, and being welcomed by the Chinese government. But you probably know that already. Now, if you work for an international company or even a local company, and you don't have these serious advantages, there is one thing that you shouldn't forget. You still have the international network to talent all over the globe, which is something that neither the local managers at multinational companies or the managers of local Chinese companies tend to have. I train, coach and advise several fully localized multinational branches in China and also local companies with international ambitions. And one of their problems is that after localization, they have nobody in the company who has the knowledge and has the network to attract international talent to their company. They don't even know how to start advertising opportunities there. So if you are a foreign manager who works in China or works on projects that involve China, or even if one of your suppliers or clients are Chinese, you have a huge asset that is very much needed right now. So please make sure that you share it and you help Chinese companies identify talent abroad, take the necessary measures to attract them into the country, and create the kind of work culture that will keep talented managers in those companies over the long run. Now, if you're an individual, especially if you're a manager or somebody with managerial potential, let's say you just finished business school, who wants to build a career in China, I would say you need two things. Number one, knowledge of Mandarin Chinese, and the other one, lots of patience. You will need the Mandarin fluency because in today's heavily localized environment, international workers, international managers will be expected to be able to work in Mandarin from a very early stage of their career. One of the findings of a recent book on international high-level executives in China is that they have to adopt to a fully Chinese-speaking environment when they are managing their teams, which is typically mostly local Chinese employees. And you will need the patience because it's a much more laborious procedure to land a good job in China today than it was, let's say, 10 or 15 years ago. If you were a student and you finished your studies in Mandarin or in English, but you do speak Mandarin, it is much more likely that you have to return to your home country or a third country, find a job there, and then return to China under an employment which is able to manage the much more difficult administrative requirements to be legally employed in the country in the long run. If you want to approach the Chinese labor market as a service provider, the good news is that it is much easier to establish a company in China right now. The bad news is that the competitive pressure is much higher than before. So let's say if you're a lawyer, a financial service provider, or for example, you want to build an app that is needed in China, it is much easier to start a company now. You may even get some government help through a startup program, but then you have to roll up your sleeves because local Chinese competitors are very agile now and they are fully aware of all the market opportunities that you might not be aware of. And finally, if you're a manager at an international company which has a high exposure to China, the good news is that there are lots of opportunities because China is still one of the most important and very often most lucrative markets for such international companies. However, please remember that opportunities in China are fewer, and again, there is a lot of competition from them. In my experience, especially from people who already have at least a few years of experience in China, and especially if they speak the language or they have family ties because they married somebody who is a Chinese national and they have a good network in the country. They can usually skip ahead of the line. Also, leaving China or staying in China has become a little bit of a loyalty issue, not only with Chinese people, but also with long-term China residents. So people who want to build a career there, very often they have to prove their commitment to this cause way ahead of being sent to China in the form of diligently learning the language, collecting information, understanding how China works, and even visiting China and building a network on their own cost. Let me encourage you to explore this topic a little bit further. If you are interested in the topic of international employment in China and the opportunities it may have for international companies, definitely check out the annual publications of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China, specifically two publications. One of them is the annual Business Confidence Survey, and the other one is the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China position paper. Both of them are very well researched cooperation between the Chamber itself and Roland Berger. And especially in the Business Confidence Survey, you are going to find a true treasure box of very easily digestible information about where the economy is going, what it means for international business people interested in China, and what the near future brings for all of us. I hope this video has been useful. Please follow the channel if you want to get my next video first. And otherwise, if you want to go a little bit further and work with me as a coach, as a speaker, as a trainer or advisor, find me online and drop me a line.